Hello, my name is Dr. Jonathan Dalton. I'm a licensed psychologist here in Maryland who specializes in working with kids and teens who are living with anxiety and related challenges. And Carroll County Public Schools approached me and asked me to record a 30-minute webinar just to help parents better understand the issues that kids are confronted with these days in terms of anxiety. So that's what I'm doing here today. Thank you very much for your time. I wish I could talk for longer than a half an hour. I could talk for hours on this topic, given the range of challenges that today's kids are experiencing. But what I want to do is I want to begin to really just go through some basic information about what kids are going through these days, how it's different from previous generations, and then most importantly, what parents and caregivers can do to help the kids who are dealing with this. It's not just teens, it's younger kids, of course, as well. But as we're going through this, I always want to begin by framing the discussion, I think, in a really accurate but strength-based way. That rather than being a flaw or a weakness, anxiety is really a shadow cast by virtues. So I'm only half joking when I say that if you have a kid who's smart, creative, and compassionate, the universe seems to throw anxiety in for free. So I tend to work with great kids from great families who are dealing with very, very high levels of anxiety. And a lot of these kids come in feeling broken or less than because of their anxiety. And I really want them to understand that it's the shadow cast by these virtues. That if you think about it, for instance, creativity and anxiety ask the same question. They both ask, what if? Just in very different ways. And the great news is that anxiety is very treatable. It's the most treatable category of mental health disorders. And these great virtues can remain fully intact if the kids can really kind of what I would call get an owner's manual for their nervous system to better understand what they're going through, to have a really informed perspective in terms of their experience of anxiety itself. So we have a lot to cover. I'm going to try and cover as much as I can in 30 minutes, but I always want to begin by really talking about the reasons why these kids are great kids. They're just extra alive in so many ways. And it's really important that we're able to have them have that perspective as well, because I tell you, a lot of them don't, because I see a lot of those kids. I'm going to begin with kind of a metaphor as we talk about anxiety versus anxiety disorders. So I want you to imagine that it's in the morning and you go downstairs, you put your toast or your bagel into your toaster, and you go upstairs to finish getting dressed. And a few minutes goes by, and then you hear the smoke alarm go off in the kitchen. Well, you can never tell by the sound of the alarm whether you burnt your toast or the bagels, or if the curtains are on fire. And that's going to be an important kind of lesson as we're talking about anxiety, because just like fire alarms, our anxiety systems tend to be on or off. And we can't really tell by the intensity of our anxiety if our perception of danger is accurate or not. Very, very similar to not being able to tell by the sound of the alarm whether it's a false alarm or not. So let's talk about healthy anxiety versus unhealthy anxiety. We call it adaptive anxiety. So the first and foremost, anxiety is a really important thing for humans to feel. It keeps us safe. It stops us from putting ourselves in dangerous situations. It's basically nature's stop sign saying there's danger ahead. And so we tend not to do things if we perceive there's danger or really large amounts of risk that are involved with the activity. Like any good alarm system, it goes off when it's supposed to, but it doesn't when it's not supposed to either. The other really important thing that anxiety and fear does for us is it helps us to not repeat mistakes. So nature wants us, if we get sick enough, hurt enough, or scared enough, to not want to do that thing again in the future. If you've ever had the unfortunate experience of having food poisoning, you'll know what I mean. Even if you know intellectually that it was just one batch that was bad of whatever you ate, your body will respond with a very powerful reaction to the idea of eating that thing again. And the same thing is true with fear. That if we get very scared in a situation, even if we intellectually know that there probably wasn't a lot of danger involved, our body, our default factory settings will tell us not to put ourselves in that situation again. So anxiety itself is really important and prioritized throughout our evolution because it keeps us alive, literally. Now, when anxiety becomes disordered or unhealthy, that's not just based on the intensity of the anxiety someone's feeling. Even professionals get this wrong. If someone's in a very dangerous situation, I want them to be very anxious because they won't get distracted. They won't forget about the thing that is dangerous in the environment. They're going to be able to focus and have large amounts of energy, which is what you need in those situations. What makes an anxiety become disordered is when it's a false alarm, when the fear is real, but the danger isn't. Now, if you think back to the example a minute ago about the smoke alarm going off, well, we don't know if our fear is, if it's valid or not based on the situation we're in. And so when we feel that anxious arousal, we call it, well, that's still nature's stop sign. And so we resort to our default factory settings and we avoid that situation. Now, avoiding things that are dangerous is wonderful. Avoiding snakes that rattle or bears that growl is fantastic. But if we are avoiding things that are scary but not dangerous, well, we're in essence firing the best teacher we will ever have in our lifetime, which is our own experience that would have taught us that while the fear was real, the danger never was. So we look at those two words, unnecessary avoidance. And if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this webinar today, it's the central role that avoidance plays in the development and maintenance of unhealthy anxiety. We want to think of avoidance itself as really the lifeblood of the anxiety disorder. So much so that I joke that, yeah, I direct an anxiety treatment center, but I don't treat an anxiety itself. I don't have to. Anxiety itself is temporary and harmless. What I treat is avoidance, and avoidance really gets in the way of people's lives. And so that's our opponent here, is the use of avoidance, because it stops us from learning. It also stops us from learning not just the situation itself was less dangerous than we feared, but probably even more importantly, we don't learn that we can handle the strong emotions of anxiety itself. And so our goal in working with the kids, and this is not simply our goal, this is what the evidence-based treatment, what the research community really understands to be true about working with kids and teens with anxiety, and by the way, for adults too, is that our goal is to decrease the use of what we call avoidant coping. We want to arm the kids with really effective but non-avoidant based skills to handle the intense emotions they're experiencing. And so what's really important is that parents can understand this, that we understand that kids are doing what they're supposed to do when they're anxious, is they're going to want to avoid that situation, or if they're already in it, they're going to want to escape. As parents, our role is to understand that fear and avoidance are teammates, okay? And so that gets the next part here, is that really good parents, in fact, the research shows that 99% of us, so basically all of us, we often get this wrong, because if we see a kid or a teen who is anxious and uncomfortable, our instincts is that we want to help them to not feel that way anymore. It's awful to see a kid struggling, to see a kid suffering in any way. So good parents react by giving a child reassurance, telling them it's going to be okay, and sometimes even saying, okay, let's not do this thing that you're afraid of doing in that situation. Now, the challenge with that, to kind of keep up this dog metaphor that's on the screen right now, is I want you to think of, for a minute, if you have a kid that you love who deals with anxiety, is to separate in your mind the child from their anxiety, just for a minute. And I want you to think of their anxiety, not the kid, but just the anxiety itself, as a dog begging for food. Only it's not begging for food, but it is begging for two other really important things. It's begging for attention, and it's begging for avoidance. Now, I'm a dog lover, and one of my dogs is begging for food. It's really frustrating, can be super annoying. And if you push them away, they'll just come back. And it could be tempting at times to say, okay, fine, here's a big piece of my steak. Now go away and never, ever beg again. But we all know immediately that's not what's going to happen. The dog's going to go away very temporarily, and it's going to come back. And when it comes back, not only will it come back, but it'll come back and beg louder and longer. And anxiety does exactly the same thing. If good parents tell their kids it's going to be okay, and we offer them really good reassurance, the anxiety will leave just like the dog for just a few minutes, but it's going to come back because now it's been given what it was begging for, which is attention. And almost everybody gets this wrong. The other thing that happens is when parents say, oh, okay, we're going to not have you do this thing that's making you anxious, even though we know it's not dangerous. Then we are also, the term we use in psychology is reinforcing the anxious behavior. And the kids will actually have more anxiety in the future if we do that. Very counterintuitive, but is really central to understanding and what happens in families and how anxiety can be really accidentally reinforced by loving families all the time. So what do we do instead? Well, there's a few things. There's kind of a three-part recommendation I'll have, and then we're gonna get into some additional things. But as parents, there are three things that I want parents to do if their child is exhibiting a lot of anxiety. Number one is I want you to name what you're seeing, and not just for the young kids. When we are overwhelmed, it's hard for us to kind of get our head around what we're experiencing. And there's good research that shows that even naming the emotion that we're experiencing decreases the severity of the emotional experience. And so saying things to a kid like, wow, it feels like you're really worried about that, whatever it might be, or it seems like you're very anxious about that test coming up this week, or whatever's going on in their lives. Just basically, we call this reflective listening, like a mirror. We're just naming what we're seeing. So the first thing is name and contain the emotion. Calling it by name is going to help the child be able to use words to express their emotions and help them to better understand and even contextualize what they're experiencing in that moment. That's number one. Number two is you want to validate their experience. You don't tell them they shouldn't be having the emotion that they're having. That's like saying that cloud is misshapen in the sky. There's no such thing. Their feelings are real, even if the danger is not. And so we validate that. That must be really hard to feel that way right now. So that you are kind of joining with them in the experience. We're not judging, we're not criticizing, we're also not endorsing it. We're just kind of acknowledging it, that it's there and that's hard. And then the third thing is to get your very best bank teller tone of voice out and to be able to say to the child or teen something along the lines of, what can you tell yourself when you feel this way? Or what are some things you can do when you're feeling this way? And in a few minutes, we'll go through some answers to that because we certainly want to be able to give them some kind of education beforehand so they have some ideas of what they can do. But it's really, really important that parents are doing those things. They're helping the child look internally for ways to cope so that they are practicing looking for appropriate skills they already possess when they're in a state of anxiety, so that over time, being anxious becomes a cue to look for those same skills rather than to look for a parent's presence next to them as a way to cope. So those are some counterintuitive, but really evidence-based and actually really effective approaches that families can use to help kids who are dealing with this. Now, I want to get into why this matters so much and how different things are. There's some scary numbers, and the numbers we'll be talking about in the next few minutes. These are pre-COVID numbers, and when we all know that they've gotten worse in the last 3 years. So these are 2019 numbers. But when it comes to anxiety and its disorders, there's three things that I want people to know about that. Number one, the most common category of mental health disorders, kids, teens, adults, across the board, most common. Number two, has the earliest age of onset of acquired disorders. So half of all individuals who will have an anxiety disorder during their lifetime will have it before they turn 11 years of age. And that's an overestimate, some people think. Some research is suggesting it's actually much younger than that. Again, teens are very strongly hit by not just anxiety, mood disorders are exploding right now post-COVID as well. But in any given day in 2019, 8% of the teens that we love will have an anxiety disorder. But look at that next one, that almost a third of all teens in this country before the age of 18, and this is pre-COVID, are going to have at least one anxiety disorder, and 8% or so will have a severe disorder. These are the kids I love working with who are avoiding major life activities like going to school. There's another video, it's a 40-minute webinar about dealing with school avoidance which is unfortunately a common concern. And one of the reasons why I give so many of these trainings and do so much outreach is that some estimates are as low as 18% of these kids receive treatment, and then only, tragically, a minority of those kids get evidence-based treatment that we know to be effective. And so the great news is that we have these really powerfully effective interventions. The terrible news is that they are tragically underutilized, and so many kids are suffering when we have effective treatments that are out there. So if you're a parent or a caregiver of a child or teen who's going through really intense anxiety, just know that these treatments are highly effective for the vast majority of individuals. So above all else, you should be very, very hopeful about ways to help these kids. The girls have it worse, like a lot of things in this life. And so the boys don't have it great. I mean, it's over 1 in 4 of the boys, but it's almost 40% of our girls in 2019, adolescents, are going to have an anxiety disorder before they turn 18. And that's 10 times the rate of what we're seeing in terms of eating disorders. As a comparison point, and this is fresh off the news, just 2 weeks ago, I'm recording this in March of 2023, there's new data from 2021 that shows that 57% of high school girls were reporting persistent sadness or hopelessness in the calendar year of 2021. So we know that, or we believe that anxiety is often a precursor for the development of more significant mood disorders. And so it is really important for us to be able to get these vulnerable kids treatment for their anxiety before it turns into something that affects kids in more difficult ways. And depression is unfortunately harder to treat, both behaviorally and with medicine, than anxiety is. So it is just so important for us to get these vulnerable kids the help that they need, so that they don't have to deal with the consequences of untreated anxiety. As a comparison point for just how different things are, there is data that suggests that in 2019, the average teen was between 5 and 8 times more likely to show symptoms of an anxiety disorder compared to the same age kids during World War II, the Great Depression, and the Cold War. And the question always comes up, are we just noticing it more, or is this actually a real increase? Well, we've been using one measurement tool for many, many decades in our field. So this actually demonstrates an increase in the suffering these kids are going through. Depression, and this is not enough time to go through depression, but the numbers are tragic in terms of where the kids are now, especially our teenagers with depression. Colleges are dealing with significant mental health challenges that they didn't see even a decade ago. So we are in the middle of it. And this is why Carroll County reached out to me to record this webinar for families, is that Carroll County Public Schools is very aware of what's happening with the number of kids who are struggling with anxiety. And as I mentioned before, unless parents are taught differently, they don't really understand what to do differently to help these kids. And it's really, really counterintuitive. Okay, so let's get into the heart of it. How do we help these kids during this storm of anxiety and all kinds of other mental health concerns that are just different than when we were kids? And so part of it is, how do we as parents and communities, how do we give these kids this lifeboat to protect them from the storm? And also, how do we give them oars? How do we teach them how to navigate? Because fundamentally, that's the important long-term skill here, is for the kids to have ways to cope effectively with it, not just the community and the parents providing them with a sheltered place, which of course is the very first step and incredibly important. So number one is that we want to help kids and teens develop a very different relationship with their anxiety. We want them to be what we call an informed observer of what's going on. So I'm going to use an extended metaphor here that I think really illustrates the point about how we develop this different relationship. So I want you to imagine, this is the Empire State Building. This is the observation deck here. And I want you to imagine that you're there visiting, it's a beautiful day, and out of nowhere, the fire alarm goes off. Well, if you're built like most of us, you're going to be 7, 8, 9, or 10 out of 10 level of anxiety. You're going to have a lot of scary thoughts popping through your head about fires. You might even have really scary images in your mind of 9/11, and you might be wondering what's going on, a lot of uncertainty. You won't be thinking about dinner plans or what you're going to be doing the next day. You will be thinking about leaving, I promise you. An urge to flee is a very important part of the anxiety response. Now, I want you to imagine the same scenario, but this time there's an announcement, and they say, "This is the superintendent of the Empire State Building. We're here with a fire marshal. There's been some problems with our fire alarm system. We'll be testing it in the next half an hour. If it happens to go off, please disregard it. And we'll make an announcement if there's anything that's actually important going on." And so you shrug your shoulders, you go about your time up there enjoying the view. 17, 18, 19 minutes goes by and the alarm goes off. Well, you're still going to jump out of your skin because you weren't expecting it to go off in that moment. If you're a worker in the building, you probably won't get a lot done while it's going off. If you're a tourist on the observation deck, you'll be really irritated and annoyed it's going off when you're there. But you probably won't have that kicked in the gut, high level of anxiety paired with an urge to flee. And the difference, and this is critical, lies not in the alarm, but rather in what you think the alarm means, or more importantly, what you think it does not mean. Because your appraisal of the alarm, what you think it means, will fundamentally and profoundly affect your experience of it. Now, when it comes to anxious nervous systems in our kids and teens, there's no off switch. We can't turn it off. It's going to go off. But we want them to see it accurately as a very irritating and annoying false alarm that gives them no useful information. Because again, their appraisal of the alarm and what it means will fundamentally and profoundly affect their experience of the alarm. So when we say an informed point of view, when their anxiety starts to act up, is to be able to kind of talk to themselves through it, to be able to remind themselves that, right now I'm having a scary thought about this thing. That's true. You're having a scary thought. And it's also true that scary thoughts are harmless. In the absence of evidence, thoughts are inconsequential. And so we want to develop a different relationship with our scary thoughts, with our anxious emotions, even with our physiology. When it gets activated with maybe your heart beating, you're getting sweaty, you're dizzy. We want to change the relationship with the individual and their experience of anxiety. Again, we want them to see it as a really irritating and annoying false alarm. And part of what we do for this is this behind the scenes footage to your own scary thoughts. Let me explain what that means. If you are watching a scary movie, our brains are not evolved enough we know intellectually we're watching a movie and they're acting and we're in a safe place, but we're still going to jump out of our seats with a jump scare, and we're still going to have our pulse quicken. Now, if we're watching the behind the scenes footage of a movie being made, even a scary movie, we don't get scared because we never forget we're just watching a movie. Whereas if we're just watching the regular movie, we want to suspend our disbelief and get pulled into the scene. That's what makes it fun. Where if you like scary movies, it's fun. And when we're able to get the behind the scenes footage to our own scary thoughts, then we're able to kind of remind ourselves that, right now I'm just telling myself a scary story in my head of what may happen in the future. I'm having a scary thought. That's true, but that's also all that's true. Scary thoughts are not predictive of outcome. Evidence might be. So we want to help kids differentiate. And this is a hard thing even for adults to do. So it's quite a challenge for a lot of kids to separate out their thoughts from evidence and feelings from facts. Thoughts happen. We don't want to believe everything that we think. We want to think of our thoughts as a salesman who knocks on our door. Just because they knock on our door does not mean that we have to buy what they're selling. Another example I use for younger kids all the time is, because they can usually relate to this, that there's some kid in their class who raises their hand first when the teacher asks a question, and they're like maybe even making noises and leaning forward off of the floor trying to get the teacher's attention. And we know, and the kids know this too, that just because they raise their hand first does not mean they have the right answer. In fact, they often don't because they haven't had time to process the question. So a lot of you know that if you call on a younger kid who's going, ooh, I know the answer, they'll often, when you call on them, they'll say, oh, I don't know, because they haven't even had time to contemplate the answer. And so we want them to understand that their first scary thought is just that. It's the first in line. It's the first one to raise its hand in your brain. It does not mean it has the right, accurate answer. And so these are all ways that we want to change fundamentally the relationship with anxious arousal. We want to see it really accurately for what it is, which is, again, that irritating and annoying false alarm. Now, before I mentioned asking kids, what can you tell yourself when you feel this way? Well, here are some answers, and these are just examples of them. We call this self-coaching. But what you'll notice about these is these are not self-reassurance. These are not reasons why they shouldn't be anxious. These are reasons to persevere, to persist in the presence of anxiety. Think about, if you're coming up with ones for your own kids, think about when you were a kid, the same age, and you were in a scary situation, whether it's going off a high dive or going on a roller coaster the first time, whatever it might be, is I want you to remember kind of what you would tell yourself when you were trying to convince yourself to do it. And what we do in our work, and again, not just us, this is what evidence-based work really entails, is about being anxious and taking, and the rest of that sentence is living. Think of it like as a passenger you take on a journey, but you never ever give it the driver's seat. So I can be anxious and you can come up with a lot of answers for that. So here are some examples that people have found useful previously. Again, there could be hundreds of these. These are only examples of things that kids and teens can tell themselves. Right now I'm having a scary thought about, or that, that's part of it. That short preamble to the scary thought helps us to remember that we're just watching a scary movie playing out inside of our heads. Fear, anxiety is temporary and harmless. I wish that could be tattooed on the inside of the eyelids of all of these kids that we work with, so that our goal here is to not decrease the anxiety. Kids come in with like, how do I get better at not being anxious? And we always tell them, no. We want to deal with anxiety the way a palm tree deals with the wind. Palm trees are not afraid of the wind because they are flexible and they know they can cope effectively with the wind. That's what the place we're trying to get these kids to, is that they're understanding that it's okay if they're anxious. We don't need to try and control our emotions because that actually doesn't work very well. Things like scary thoughts can't hurt me. Yeah, I can have scary thoughts. I can think about whatever you can think about. And I can think about the sun exploding, or alien invasions, all kinds of things. But that's okay, because scary thoughts have never hurt anybody. Just because I feel scared doesn't mean anything bad's going to happen. That's a kid version of this is a false alarm, right? The presence of this emotion does not tell us anything about the reality of the danger. It just doesn't. I love the next one too. Just because I'm scared doesn't mean I can't do it. Courage is what you do. It's never what you feel. And helping kids to understand, if I could tell the kids one thing, it would be this: you can be scared and brave at the same time. That's central to the work that we do, is that we can overrule the stop sign in our head saying, don't do that thing. We can look for evidence. If it's a dangerous thing, yeah, we're not going to do that thing. But if it's not dangerous, but we know we're still afraid of it, that's when we lean forward into the experience itself. And we realize that you are stronger than your fear. Yes, you can have the fear, and yes, you can overrule the urge to avoid. You can choose to pursue your values, even at a young age, rather than pursuing your comfort. And so these are things that we want kids to practice so they can get really skillful at using these things, so that when the time comes when they're actually in an anxiety-producing situation, they can kind of pull these out, like, oh yeah, that's right. I can be scared and brave at the same time. I'm stronger than my fear. Just because I'm anxious doesn't mean I can't do it. Those things are really important for these kids to know. So let me tell a quick story. A few years ago, I was working with this wonderful young woman, and she was really affected by anxiety. She had missed a lot of school, like years of school. And she had a lot of social anxiety, was very shy. And so I gave her this sentence to fill in the blank, our second session. I said, I can be anxious and blank at the same time. And she thought about it for a while and got this firm look on her face. And she leaned in a firm voice, looked me in the eye, and she said, Dr. Dalton, I can be anxious and strong at the same time. And she was right. And my goodness, she was an impressive young person. And yes, I've used that line ever since, that we can all be anxious and strong at the same time. And that is the fundamental message that we want the kids to have. Now, one of the ways that parents can help with that is by coping out loud, talking about times when you were anxious and you still did it. We know that's a great way to cultivate these experiences for these kids. So these are some fundamental skills that we want kids to know. I'm going to end on a different note, because I think this is a core important aspect of anxiety reduction, and that's the self-confidence kids have in their own ability to cope. I mentioned before that when we avoid something, not only do we not learn about the thing, but we don't learn about ourselves. And this is where it is so important to help kids, to have parents tell the kids that, yeah, this is hard, it's going to be anxious, and I believe in you. Because what we're looking for here, in psychology, we call it self-efficacy. All it means is how effective someone believes they will be in coping with the situation that they're experiencing. And so fundamentally, we don't want the kids to think that they're going to be okay because they won't be anxious. Our goal is to get them to a place where they know they're going to be okay, even if they're anxious. And so I tell this little story, again, kind of a metaphor, that let's say that there is a bird on a branch, and this bird looks over and it sees that the branch that it's sitting on is breaking and has a crack in it. Is the bird unafraid because it can think of all the reasons why the branch is strong and unlikely to break? Or is the bird unafraid because it knows it can fly? Knowing you can fly is self-efficacy. That's that thing that we want to cultivate in these kids. They're going to be okay, not just because a bad or hard thing isn't going to happen, that's reassurance, but because they can handle bad and hard things. They're going to be okay, not because they won't be anxious, but because they can handle the experience of anxiety. They can be strong and anxious at the same time. They can be scared and brave at the same time. That is the core message. And we want parents to help the kids discover that fundamental truth by encouraging them to lean into their anxious thoughts and feelings, to have an informed perspective of what's going on, but also to know what's not going on. A scary thought is not evidence. And we want the kids to learn that they can do more than they thought. And they learn that by the experiences of outlasting the anxiety, of doing things while they're anxious. So with that, I know I went a little bit over. I know we only have a short time together, but this is such an important concept. So in summary, there are many, many kids who are struggling exponentially more than in previous generations. There are very effective interventions that can be provided in school, out of school. They are underutilized. And right now, post-COVID, there's a waiting list everywhere. Obviously, we're aware of that. And so there's not enough to go around. We're working on it. And that's part of the reason Carroll County is working with me, providing this to you, is to give more information to families to help with this process. But just know that kids, teens, adults who are going through this experience of anxiety, they can learn new important skills to cope in ways that don't involve avoidance. And by doing so, diminish the suffering markedly that they're experiencing with the anxiety. So I hope this was helpful. And thank you so much for your time today.